So today we're going to be talking about the last section in chapter 5, and it's called the spread of Hellenistic culture. And so Hellenistic, again, the root word there is Hellespont, and it's just another way of referring to the Greeks. And Hellenistic is really referring to this blending of Greek culture with Egyptian, with Asian, with Persian, with European, and just the reality that you can find elements of Greek culture all over the ancient world. So, when Alexander the Great would conquer a place, he would found a city. And he tended to name them after himself. Again, the guy is like textbook megalomaniac. He really saw a lot of himself. I mean, he thought of himself as the son of Zeus, as a god. He was a conqueror. He spent his life at war. But where he was really a progressive is that he believed in uniting people, bringing people together of different cultures, of different faiths, of different ways of life. And that was his justification for trying to conquer and to build this huge empire. And he was quite successful at that, though his political empire fell apart quickly. The cultural impact of his conquest are still being felt today. And so Alexandria grew to be one of the greatest Egyptian cities and really one of the high points of Greek culture in the Western world. So Alexandria was home to one of the 5 wonders of the ancient world, and that was the lighthouse at Pharos. It was the tallest structure of its time, 350 feet tall.
How tall is that?
Is it taller than the building?
Absolutely, yes. So 350 feet.
Is it like
Probably up there with the Statue of Liberty, if I had to
is
guess.
that legal building height without like having some sort of light on it? Is that like 290 feet?
That's a good question. I don't know. I do know that one thing that makes it a wonder of the ancient world is that to have a structure like this without steel is incredible. I mean, how do you build a structure like this without steel? I mean, before we began to mass produce steel, there were no skyscrapers. And yet there's this one.
Joke's on you.
And so it makes it a wonder of the ancient world, but it doesn't exist anymore. And perhaps it's due to that basic problem. Without a solid foundation like steel, structures like this can fall apart in earthquakes. Can fall apart. I'm sorry? That no longer exists. No, this is just an artist's rendering of it. It's cool. It dates back to the time of Alexander the Great. Perhaps the ruins still exist, but no, this tower does not stand. And it was the tallest structure of the ancient world, developed by the Greeks. They had the largest museum of the ancient world, the largest zoo. You get the point. The largest library. And the library at Alexandria was said to contain all of the great works of ancient literature and was said to contain the largest collection of written works in the world at that time. So, Alexandria became a center for culture, meaning that if you wanted to go into the sciences, if you wanted to develop new technologies, if you wanted to work in emerging industries, this is where you went. And so Alexandria attracted scholars from all over the world. For example, at this city, the astronomer Aristarchus was able to prove that the sun was bigger than the earth. So the ancient conception was what was called Heliocentrism, geocentrism, which means it was once believed that the earth was the center of the world. And it was once believed that, of course, when the sun goes up and goes down, ancient people thought that it was the sun revolving around the world, not the other way around. And ancient peoples also thought that there could be no structure, no heavenly body larger than our planet. And that was just caught up in the mythology of the time. In fact, Aristotle taught that the earth was a perfect sphere, and that a sphere represented perfection. Of course, we know now it's not a perfect sphere. That the gravitational movement around the sun is not a perfect circle, that it's an ellipsis. And how do we explain that? Through gravity. But Aristotle thought all these things had to be perfect circles because he believed in heavenly symmetry. And so, again, primitive people thought that there's no way the sun was bigger because look at it. But he was able to prove this without even having a telescope. Yes, ma'am.
How did they end up like proving so long ago that the orbit around the sun wasn't a perfect circle?
Wasn't an ellipsis, or that it was an ellipsis and not a circle. So the heliocentric theory, and that is that the Earth revolves around the sun. The earliest astronomers to really theorize this date back to Iraq, in fact, in Baghdad. The earliest astronomers began to pick this up, a guy named Ptolemy. But where it really became famous is an Italian astronomer named Copernicus. And he developed this theory that the Earth revolved around the sun, called it the heliocentric theory, and now we accept it as fact. Okay, so that's just one of the things that came out of Alexandria, this unintentional result of Alexander's conquest. So again, planets revolve around the sun, not the other way around. It would take 1,400 years for this theory to become generally accepted.
Oh, dang.
I mean, even you'll find elements of this in ancient religious writings. For example, in the Old Testament, there was a case where the Israelites were fighting a battle and they asked God to stop the sun. And according to the story in the Old Testament, the sun stops and then it goes backwards. But in reality, that can't happen because it's not the sun that's stopping, it would be the Earth's rotation that's stopping. And so you have this ancient understanding of the world that continued to endure for so many more years. Now, the real question of how are they figuring these things out? For example, Aristophanes was able to figure out how big the Earth was using geometry. Now, granted, he didn't take a tape measure and then walk all the way around the world. There's no way. They didn't have the technology. They didn't have anything that could do that.
They didn't know that the world was like more than where they lived, right?
Well, I mean, the ancient Greek concept was that the Mediterranean was Middle Earth, at the middle of the world. And they're still not going to get to the idea of a round world for a little while longer. But what he was able to do is to theorize the size of the planet. And by taking measurements and then using geometry to kind of like branch out from there. Some Greek advances in mathematics. A mathematician named Euclid developed, speaking of geometry, he developed the basic principles that the science of geometry are based upon. And the concept of leverage, for example, in basic physics, were developed by Greek scientists like Archimedes, who once said, "Give me a lever large enough and I can move the world." Not only did he develop the physics to give us the understanding behind leverage, but he also developed some new inventions, like an early force pump and an early steam engine even. The concept that boiling water under pressure creates the potential for energy, and that pressure can be harnessed, captured, and used. Now, the Greeks are also known for their philosophy. And, when you begin to read the writings of Plato and Socrates and Aristotle, you can begin to find elements of these ways of thinking in our own lives. And a couple others that we haven't talked about yet. For example, the Stoic philosophy is a word that we still use. If someone is stoic, it's a way of describing their apparent lack of emotion. If you handle hardship with stoicism, some would see that as a virtue. But then on the other side, the Greek philosopher Epicurus really made famous the philosophy of hedonism. And, if you go to a Greek restaurant, Epicurean food is a Greek style of food, really focused on luxury and lavishness and quality. Because Epicurus believed that people should focus on the here and now And in fact, you'll find him quoted even in the New Testament, talking about eat, drink, and be merry is a concept from the Greek philosopher Epicurus. So this guy said that.
Eat, drink, be merry?
Yeah, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you shall die. That was Epicurus. Yeah.
You got that, Hannah?
Okay. Another important concept in Greek history, really spreading out and influencing the rest of the world, is sculpture. So the Greeks developed the tallest structure. They also built the tallest sculpture, over 100 feet tall. The Colossus of Rhodes was so large that there was one side on one point in the harbor, another side on the other, and ships would go underneath it. Now again, these buildings don't have steel. They're carvings of stone, meaning that this thing isn't around anymore. An earthquake shook the ground, poor Colossus fell over. Yeah, but nonetheless, even though it's one of the wonders of the ancient world, it doesn't exist anymore, but it's incredible to think about. And these sculptures have been influential. And so realism in sculpture, focusing on creating or recreating the natural world. So again, here's Colossus of Rhodes, an artist rendering.